What if a man who had buried his heart in the wilderness was forced to face it again, not by the ghost of his past, but by the cry of a future he never asked for? This is a story for anyone who has ever felt that silence was the only safe place left, only to find that a single heartbeat can be louder than any storm. He was a man made of winter and stone. She was a woman with nothing left but a prayer. And the baby between them was the only thing that could teach them both the meaning of spring. The forest held its breath, waiting. The wind, a bitter predator, stalked the ridges of the lonely mountain, its howl swallowing the last of the day's grey light. It tore through the pines with a sound like tearing cloth, promising a night of brutal, unforgiving cold. In his cabin, nestled in a hollow, the wind seemed to despise most of all. Silas Blackwood laid another log on the fire. The flames leaped, hungry, casting his craggy, bearded face in a dance of light and shadow. It was a face that had forgotten how to smile, with eyes the colour of a frozen lake, holding memories he never spoke of. He had built this life of solitude with his own 2 hands, a fortress of silence against a world that had taken everything from him years ago. His wife, his son, gone in a fever dream of smoke and sorrow. Now, his only companions were the rhythmic pop of the fire, the groan of the cabin walls, and the ghost of a child's laughter that sometimes echoed in the silence, a phantom pain that never truly faded. He was just settling into his chair, a worn book in his lap, when he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was not the shriek of the wind or the crack of a frozen branch. It was a cry, thin and desperate, a pinprick of life in a vast, dying landscape. Silas froze, every nerve in his body alight. He told himself it was the wind, a trick of the air, a grief-crazed fantasy. But then it came again, closer this time, a raw, pleading wail that snagged on his heart like a thorn. Cursing under his breath, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and pushed the door open into the teeth of the blizzard. The snow clawed at him, blinding him, but he pushed forward, following the sound. There, on his doorstep, half buried in a fresh drift, was a bundle of rags. It moved. It cried. Silas knelt, his calloused fingers brushing away the snow to reveal a small, blue-lipped baby, its face pinched with cold and hunger. Wrapped tightly in a threadbare shawl, it was a tiny flicker of life on the verge of being extinguished. As he stared, his mind reeled back to another small face, another tiny hand that had once gripped his finger. A wave of nausea and rage washed over him. He should close the door. He should let the wilderness claim what it would. It was not his fight, not anymore. But the baby's cry softened to a whimper, a sound so full of helpless surrender that it shattered the ice around his heart. With a guttural groan that was part curse, part prayer, Silas scooped up the bundle. He turned back to the cabin, the warmth, the light, and felt another presence. A shape, crumpled and dark, lay a few yards away, almost completely consumed by the snow. It was a woman. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that this was the mother. He had a choice, to save one or to try and save them both. The wilderness watched, silent and judging, as the man who had walled himself off from the world carried the future and its past back into his home. The fire, which had been his only comfort, now seemed to mock him with its warmth, a warmth he hadn't shared in a decade. He laid the infant on the rough-hewn table, unwrapping the damp rags with a strange, clumsy tenderness. The baby was a girl, he realised, her tiny body trembling, her skin mottled and cold. Her breath was a shallow whisper. He worked with a grim efficiency that came from a life of survival. He warmed a blanket by the hearth until it was almost too hot to touch and wrapped her in it, her small body lost in the thick wool. He warmed a little water, testing it on his wrist with a forgotten instinct, and tried to coax a few drops between her pale lips with the tip of his finger. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her life a fragile thread about to snap. Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the night the fire took his world. He had failed then. He had been helpless. He would not be helpless now. He looked at the woman he had dragged in from the snow. She was young, her face gaunt and smudged with dirt, her dress thin and torn. He had laid her on the floor by the fire, her breathing as shallow as the child's. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, and right now, he didn't care. They were lives, and his cabin, his fortress of solitude, had become a hospital. For hours, he moved between them. He forced warm broth, thin and watery, into the woman's mouth until she stirred, moaning softly. He returned to the child, placing his finger against her chest, feeling for the faint, fluttery beat of her heart. He held her tiny, frigid hand in his own massive, calloused one and willed her to live. He did not pray with words. He did not know how anymore. Instead, he prayed with action, with the stubborn refusal to let death have another victory in his home. As dawn threatened to break, painting the frosted windows with a pale, ghostly light, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were wide with a terror that was old and deep. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, landing on the looming shape of Silas, then snapping to the bundle on the table. A raw animal sound escaped her throat, and she tried to push herself up, to crawl toward her child, but she collapsed, too weak. "She's alive," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. The woman stared at him, her fear warring with a desperate hope. He saw it in her eyes. She didn't know if he was a savior or a captor. He picked up the bundled infant and carried her to her mother, laying her gently in the crook of the woman's arm. The woman's hand came up, stroking the baby's cheek with a touch so reverent, it made Silas's own heart ache. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Silas just grunted and turned back to the fire. Thanks were a currency he no longer traded in. He had acted on instinct, the same instinct that told him to split wood before a storm or to check his traps at dawn. It was survival, nothing more. But as he stared into the flames, he felt the unwelcome stir of something else, a thaw in the frozen lake of his soul. For the first time in years, the silence of his cabin was broken, not by the ghosts of his past, but by the soft, steady breathing of two strangers who now depended on him completely. The woman's name was Alara. She told him this on the second day, her voice still a fragile whisper. The baby's name was Lily. She said the name like a prayer, a shield against the world that had tried to steal her. The storm raged outside for 3 days, cocooning them in a world of white and wind. Inside, a different kind of storm was settling into an uneasy peace. Silas gave Alara his bed, a simple cot in the corner, and he slept in his chair by the fire, a rifle resting against the wall beside him. He told himself it was for protection against the wolves that sometimes grew bold in the blizzards. He did not admit, even to himself, that he was guarding the first flicker of life his home had seen in a decade. Alara watched him constantly. She saw the way his large hands could be surprisingly gentle as he added a spoonful of honey to Lily's warm water. She saw the weariness in his eyes that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He was a man haunted by ghosts, and she, a woman running from them, recognized a fellow soul adrift. He spoke little, asking no questions about where she came from or why she was traveling alone in a blizzard with a newborn. His silence was a gift, a space for her to breathe without the weight of explanation. On the third morning, Lily's cry was stronger, a healthy, demanding sound that startled Silas from his doze. Alara was too weak to produce milk, and the baby's hunger was becoming a fierce, desperate thing. Silas knew he couldn't wait any longer. "I'm going to town," he announced, pulling on his heavy boots. "For supplies." Ilara's eyes widened with a fresh wave of fear. Town? Stone Creek. A day's ride, if the drifts aren't too deep. "You can't," she pleaded, clutching Lily tighter. "He'll find us. He'll be looking." Silas paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't ask who he was. The terror in her voice was explanation enough. "The baby needs milk," he said, his voice flat. "I'll be back by nightfall. Bolt the door behind me. Use the rifle if you have to. It's loaded." He didn't wait for a reply. He stepped out into the blinding white, the cold a familiar, biting embrace. The world he had shunned for so long was now a place he had to enter, not for himself, but for the tiny life he had sworn he would not fail. As he saddled his horse, the beast snorting clouds of steam into the frigid air, Silas felt a bitter irony. He had built his walls so high to keep the world out, and now he was riding back into it to save two people who had stumbled right through them. The silence he had so carefully cultivated was gone, replaced by the ghost of a baby's cry that followed him down the mountain path. He was no longer just a man with a past. He was a man with a charge, and in the unforgiving wilderness, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. Stone Creek was less a town and more a scar on the landscape, a handful of wooden buildings clinging to the side of a muddy track. It was a place for trappers, miners, and men who had more secrets than dollars. Silas hadn't set foot in it for over a year, and his arrival did not go unnoticed. As he tied his horse outside the general store, whispers followed him like crows. Men stopped their conversations to stare at the big, silent man from the mountain, his beard wild, his eyes holding a winter of their own. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and suspicion. The proprietor, a Weasley man named Finch, eyed him from behind the counter. "Blackwood," Finch said, a little too loudly. "Thought a bear got you." Silas ignored him, his eyes scanning the shelves. He found what he was looking for, a few tins of condensed milk and a bag of flour. He placed them on the counter along with a pouch of coins. Finch counted the money slowly. "Heard a wicked storm blew through up your way," he said, probing. "It was a storm," Silas replied, his voice a low growl that discouraged further questions. But Finch wasn't easily deterred. "Funny thing," he went on, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Sheriff was in here yesterday, asking questions. A rich fella from back east, name of Thorne, put up a notice, looking for his wife. Said she ran off, stole something of his." Finch slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a formal notice, the lettering crisp and authoritative. It described a young woman with dark hair and fearful eyes. It offered a substantial reward for her return, and warned that she was unstable and prone to fantasy. Silas's blood ran cold. He looked at the description again. It was Ilara. He crumpled the notice in his fist. "Means nothing to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He grabbed his supplies and turned to leave. At the door, a trapper he recognized only by sight stopped him. "You best be careful up there, Blackwood," the trapper muttered, not meeting his eyes. "That Thorne fella, he ain't the kind of man you cross. He owns the law in these parts." Silas didn't respond. He swung onto his horse and rode out of Stone Creek, the weight of the condensed milk in his saddlebag feeling heavier than lead. The journey back up the mountain was a race against the setting sun and the creeping dread in his gut. He now knew the name of the ghost Ilara was running from. Thorne. And he knew that the walls of his cabin, which had stood against blizzards and wolves, might not be strong enough to stand against the cruelty of men. When he finally saw the flicker of lamplight from his window, a feeling of relief so fierce it almost buckled him washed over. He had left a stranger and a baby in his home. He was returning to something that felt dangerously, terrifyingly, like his to protect. The quiet had been broken, and now, The world was knocking at his door. He found Ilara exactly where he'd left her, huddled by the fire, the rifle across her lap. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, were fixed on the door. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight but expecting to lose. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to taste. When she saw it was him, a shudder of relief ran through her, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. He set the supplies on the table without a word. The tins of milk were a promise. He opened one with his hunting knife, mixed the thick, sweet liquid with warm water, and poured it into a bottle he had fashioned from a small flask and a piece of clean leather. This time, when he offered it to Lily, the baby drank, her small mouth working greedily. The sound of her soft suckling was the only sound in the room, a tiny anchor in a sea of unspoken terror. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. Inside, a war was raging. The man who had sought oblivion in solitude was now tethered to this small, fragile life. Every drop of milk she drank was a link in a chain, binding him to her mother, to the trouble that was surely coming. After Lily was fed and sleeping soundly in a makeshift cradle he'd built from a crate, Ilara finally spoke. "You saw the notice," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Thorn," he said, the name like a stone in his mouth. "He's your husband." "He is my keeper," she corrected, her voice trembling with a quiet fury. "I was an orphan he took as a ward. When I was old enough, he decided I would be his wife. It was a transaction, not a marriage. He owns the house, the clothes I wear, the air I breathe. He wanted an heir, a son." She looked down at Lily, her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound sorrow. He did not want a daughter. The story tumbled out of her in broken pieces. A life of gilded cages, of quiet corrections that felt like blows, of a possessiveness that masqueraded as love. She had planned her escape for months, saving small amounts of money, plotting a route west to a distant relative she wasn't even sure would take her in. The blizzard had been a cruel, unexpected twist of fate, forcing her to seek shelter at the one place she thought was empty. "He will not stop," she whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "He doesn't care about me. He cares about what I took from him, his property, his pride." Silas listened, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He had seen men like Thorn before, men who used their power like a club, who believed the world and everyone in it was theirs for the taking. He had fought them in a war that was supposed to be about freedom, only to find their kind flourishing in the peace that followed. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling inadequate, hollow. "For how long?" she asked, her gaze meeting his. "This mountain can't hide us forever." "It's hidden me for 10 years, he replied grimly. "Let's see if it can manage a while longer." That night, a fragile routine began to form. Silas chopped wood with a renewed ferocity, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing through the silent forest. He set more traps, checked the perimeter of his land, his senses on high alert. Ilara, regaining her strength, tended to the cabin. She swept the floors, mended his worn shirt with thread pulled from her own dress, and filled the small space with a quiet, purposeful energy it hadn't known. It was a strange, silent dance of two broken people creating something whole. He would come in from the cold, and she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting. She would wake from a nightmare, and the sight of his broad-shouldered silhouette in the chair by the fire would chase the darkness away. They rarely spoke of the future or the past. They lived in the small, precious moments of the present, a family forged by a storm, holding their breath against the coming tide. Days bled into a week, and the sharp edges of their fear began to soften, worn down by the rhythm of their shared existence. The cabin, once a tomb of memory for Silas, began to feel like a home. He found himself watching Alara as she hummed a soft lullaby to Lily, her dark hair catching the firelight. He saw the strength in her slender frame, the resilience that had carried her through a blizzard with a newborn, and felt a stir of admiration that was dangerously close to tenderness. He started leaving small offerings for her on the table in the mornings, a perfectly carved bird from a piece of scrap wood, a rare wintergreen leaf he'd found near the creek. He never acknowledged them, and she never mentioned them, but the unspoken gratitude hung in the air between them, warm and sweet. One afternoon, Lily, nestled in a blanket on the floor, let out a gurgle that sounded remarkably like a laugh. She was looking at Silas, who was clumsily trying to fix the leg of the rocking chair. He froze, his hands still. He hadn't heard a baby laugh in this cabin in over a decade. The sound was a ghost, a memory and a promise, all at once. A slow, rusty smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that transformed his rugged face. Alara saw it, and her heart gave a painful lurch. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was devastatingly beautiful. That evening, as the shadows grew long, she found the courage to ask. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, her hands busy mending one of Lily's rags. "Why did you come here?" Silas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if the answers were written in the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed grief. "I had a family," he began. "A wife, Sarah. A son, Jacob. He was 5. He paused, swallowing hard. There was a fire, a faulty chimney. I was out, checking the lines. By the time I got back, he didn't need to finish. The story was in the hollows of his face, in the permanent winter of his eyes. I couldn't save them. I pulled my wife out, but it was too late. And Jacob, I couldn't get to him. The roof came down." He fell silent, the weight of his failure a tangible presence in the room. "I came here because the silence was the only thing that didn't scream at me for what I couldn't do." Alara's own eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for him. She reached out, her hand resting hesitantly on his arm. His muscles tensed at the unexpected touch, but he didn't pull away. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved Lily. You didn't fail." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a stranger or a burden. He saw a woman who understood loss, who had stared into the abyss and hadn't flinched, and in her eyes, he saw a reflection of a man he thought had died in the fire. A protector, a father, a husband. The touch lingered, a fragile bridge between two solitudes. The unspoken thing between them was no longer just shared danger. It was shared sorrow and the beginning of a shared hope. The walls of his fortress were crumbling, not from an attack, but from a gentle, persistent warmth that was seeping through the cracks. The outside world intruded 2 weeks after the storm, not with the crack of a rifle, but with the crunch of boots on snow. Silas was splitting logs when he saw him, a lone figure making his way up the mountain path. It was the trapper from town, a man named Jeb. He moved with a nervous energy, his eyes darting towards the cabin. Silas rested his axe and waited, his body a silent wall of inquiry. Jeb stopped a few yards away, twisting his fur hat in his hands. "Blackwood," he stammered. I didn't want to do this, but Thorn, he's paying good money for information, and my kids ain't eaten well in a month." Silas's face remained impassive, carved from stone. "Get on with it, Jeb." "He's in town. Thorn. He's been buying drinks, making promises. He told the sheriff he's organising a party to search the mountain for his poor lost wife." Jeb swallowed hard. "He knows she came this way. Finch told him you bought milk, condensed milk, not the kind a man buys for himself." The words hung in the cold air. The world had found them. "He's coming. Jeb finished, his voice barely a whisper. Tomorrow, at dawn, he and the sheriff. He says he's just coming to talk, to bring her home. But the way he said it, it wasn't right. Jeb looked past Silas at the cabin where a thin tendril of smoke curled from the chimney. I figured you ought to know. A man deserves to know when trouble's coming to his door. Without another word, Jeb turned and hurried back down the path, a man torn between his conscience and his coin. Silas stood motionless for a long time, the axe handle cold in his hand. The fragile piece they had built was about to be shattered. He went inside, the grim news settling in his gut. Ilara knew the moment he walked through the door. She saw it in the hard set of his jaw, the renewed winter in his eyes. He's coming, she stated, her voice devoid of its earlier fear, replaced now by a cold, hard resolve. Silas nodded. Tomorrow. With the sheriff. Ilara looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm of pure innocence. A fierce, protective love surged through her, extinguishing the last of her fear. She would not let that man lay a hand on her child. She would die first. We can't run, she said, looking up at Silas. The snow is too deep, and Lily is too small. We wouldn't make it a mile. We're not running, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He walked to the wall and took down his rifle, the same one he had offered her for protection. He checked the mechanism with practiced, lethal efficiency. He was no longer just a woodsman, a hermit. He was the man he had been before the fire, before the grief. A soldier, a protector. You said this mountain has hidden you for 10 years, Ilara said, her voice steady. Yes, he replied, not looking at her. Then let it hide us, she said, a glint of steel in her eyes. Let him come. He thinks he's coming for a frightened woman and a helpless baby. He's not. He's coming to your home, and you are not the kind of man who lets predators walk through his door. Silas finally looked at her, and a spark of something fierce and proud passed between them. She was right. He had run from the world, but he would not run from this. He had built this life, this fortress, and he would defend it. He would defend them. The cabin was no longer his prison of grief. It was their sanctuary, and he would be its guardian. The night was a long, breathless vigil. They didn't sleep. The fire was banked low, and the only light came from the sliver of a moon that broke through the clouds, casting the snow-covered forest in an ethereal blue-white glow. They sat in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a shared purpose. Silas cleaned his rifle, his movements methodical and calming. Ilara sharpened the kitchen knives, her face set in a mask of determination. Lily slept, blissfully unaware of the coming storm. Around midnight, Ilara stood up and went to the small chest where she kept her few belongings. She pulled out a folded yellowed piece of paper and handed it to Silas. It's a letter, she explained, from my mother's sister, the one I was trying to reach. It describes how Thorn took me in, how he controlled every aspect of my life. It says she feared for my safety. Silas read it, his brow furrowed. It was a testament to a long, quiet reign of terror. Is it enough? She asked. It's her word against his, he said grimly. And he has money. Money buys truth in a town like Stone Creek. He handed it back to her. But it's something. Keep it safe. He rose and went to the window, peering out into the silent, waiting woods. The sheriff, what's his name? Henderson, Ilara supplied. He seems tired, like he doesn't want trouble. Men like that can be swayed, Silas mused. They follow the path of least resistance. We have to make standing with Thorn the harder path. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and rose, Silas went outside. He didn't build barricades or set obvious traps. His preparations were subtler, woven into the fabric of the mountain itself. He moved a fallen log to partially obscure the path. He loosened the snow on an overhanging branch. He used the terrain he knew as intimately as his own skin, creating a landscape that was just a little more treacherous, a little more unwelcoming to outsiders. He was turning the mountain into an ally. When he returned, Elara had coffee ready. She met his gaze, her own fear held tightly in check. "I'm scared," she admitted in a small voice. "I know," he said. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before he gently squeezed her shoulder. It was a gesture of profound intimacy for a man like him, a promise of shared strength. "But you are not alone, not anymore." The sound of horses came just as the sun crested the ridge. 2 riders, as Jeb had said. Sheriff Henderson, a stout man whose face was etched with reluctance, and Marcus Thorne, who rode with an arrogant posture, his fine city clothes looking absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Silas stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself in the center of the doorway. He didn't hold his rifle, but it was just inside, leaning against the frame, within easy reach. "Blackwood," the sheriff called out, his voice uneasy. "We've come to speak with a Mrs. Elara Thorne. We have reason to believe she's here." "There's no one here by that name," Silas replied, his voice calm and cold as the mountain air. Thorne dismounted, a cruel, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. Now, let's not play games. I know she's in there. My dear, fragile wife. She's not well. She needs my care." He started towards the cabin. "That's close enough," Silas said. The words were not a shout, but they stopped Thorne in his tracks. "This is my property. You are not welcome here." Thorne's charming facade cracked, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. "Your property," he sneered. "This hovel? I am here to reclaim my property. The woman in that cabin is my wife, by law and by God. You are harboring a runaway, and that is a crime." Sheriff Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Blackwood, he has the law on his side. He just wants to talk to her." "Then he can talk from there," Silas said, gesturing to the spot where Thorne stood. At that moment, the cabin door opened, and Elara stepped out to stand beside Silas. She held Lily, wrapped tightly in a wool blanket against her chest. Her face was pale, but her back was straight, her eyes blazing with a fire Thorne had never seen before. "I am not your property, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I am not going anywhere with you." Thorne's face darkened with rage. "You foolish girl! Do you think this savage can protect you from me? I own this town. I own the law. Sheriff, do your duty. Arrest this man and return my wife to me." Henderson looked from Thorne's furious face to the defiant stance of the couple on the porch. He saw the baby in Elara's arms. He saw the protective way Silas stood, a silent mountain of a man. He saw the truth, and it made him deeply weary. "Now, Marcus," the sheriff began, trying to de-escalate. "Let's just all calm down. There's no need for—" "I am done calming down," Thorne roared. He took another step forward, his hand reaching inside his fine coat. But before he could draw the small pistol Silas knew was there, a low, ominous creak came from above. The snow-laden branch Silas had prepared, disturbed by the horse's movement, finally gave way. A miniature avalanche of heavy, wet snow crashed down, missing Thorne by inches but spooking his horse and sending the sheriff's mount rearing. In the ensuing chaos, Silas moved with deceptive speed. He was not on Thorne, but on the sheriff, closing the distance and speaking in a low, urgent voice only Henderson could hear. "Look at her, Sheriff. Look at the fear in her eyes. Is that the look of a woman who needs to be returned to a loving husband? You've seen the notice. Unstable. Prone to fantasy. That's the talk of a bully, not a husband. You know what he is, and you know that if you let him take her, whatever happens to her, and that child will be on your hands. Henderson looked at Alara, who was clutching her baby, her eyes pleading. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her temple, partially hidden by her hair, a mark he hadn't noticed before. He looked at Thorn, whose face was a mask of pure, ugly rage, and he made a choice. "That's enough, Thorn," Henderson said, his voice now firm. "We're leaving. This is a domestic matter that will be settled properly, not like this." "What?" Thorn spun on him, incredulous. "Are you defying me?" "I'm doing my job," the sheriff said, reining in his horse. "And my job is to keep the peace, not to be your personal army. We'll ride back to town and send for a circuit judge. Until then, the woman stays where she is." Thorn stared at him, his mouth agape. He had been challenged, his authority questioned. For a man like him, it was an unforgivable insult. He shot a look of pure venom at Silas and Alara. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You've made a powerful enemy today, both of you." He mounted his horse and, without another glance at the sheriff, galloped recklessly down the mountain path. Henderson watched him go, then tipped his hat grimly towards the cabin. "You've got a day, maybe two," he said. "Use it." Then he too turned and rode away, leaving Silas and Alara alone in the echoing silence of the clearing, victors of a battle, but with the war far from over. The reprieve was a fragile, precious thing. As soon as the sound of hoofbeats faded, Alara sagged against the doorframe, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. Silas's hand shot out to steady her. For a moment, they just stood there, his hand on her arm, the warmth of his touch, a solid, reassuring presence. The unspoken bond between them had been forged in the crucible of the morning's confrontation. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were allies, partners in a desperate fight. They went back inside, the chill of the encounter clinging to them. The small cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. "A day," Alara whispered, sinking into a chair. "What can we do in a day?" Silas began to pace, a caged bear in the small space. His mind, accustomed to the slow, deliberate rhythms of the wilderness, was now racing, calculating, planning. "We can't stay here," he said, thinking aloud. "Thorn won't wait for a judge. He'll be back with hired men the sheriff can't control." "But where can we go?" Alara asked, her voice laced with despair. "The trails are still thick with snow." "With Lily, there are other paths," Silas said, his eyes distant. "Ways through these mountains that don't show up on any map, places a man like Thorn would never find." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his decision made. "I had a hunting cabin, miles from here, deeper in the woods. It's small, rough, but it's hidden. We can get there." Hope, a small tentative flicker, sparked in Alara's chest. "Can we make it?" He nodded. "It will be hard, but it's our only chance." The rest of the day was a flurry of quiet, urgent preparation. Silas packed supplies, dried meat, flour, the precious tins of milk, ammunition for his rifle. He gathered furs and heavy blankets. Alara dressed Lily in as many layers as she could, fashioning a small sling so she could carry the baby close to her chest, sharing her body heat. As they worked, a new kind of intimacy bloomed between them. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their actions synchronized. He would hand her a strap, and she would know exactly how to tie the knot. She would point to a shelf, and he would retrieve the herbs she needed without a word. They were a team, their every movement a testament to the trust that had grown between them. As dusk fell, they stood ready to leave. The cabin looked stark and empty, stripped of the life they had brought to it. Ilara felt a pang of sadness. This place, which she had stumbled upon in desperation, had become the first safe home she had ever known. Silas looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the cold hearth, the empty cot. He was leaving behind 10 years of self-imposed exile, 10 years of ghosts. He was walking back into the world, not as the man who had failed, but as the man who was determined not to fail again. "It's time," he said softly. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and picked up the heavy pack. Ilara adjusted Lily in the sling, the baby's soft breath warming her neck. She took one last look at the cabin, then turned to Silas, her face resolute. She was ready. Silas led the way, not down the main path, but into the thick, dark woods behind the cabin. The journey was a brutal ordeal. The snow was deep, and they sank to their knees with every step. The wind had picked up again, a low, mournful howl that seemed to mock their escape. Silas moved ahead, breaking a trail, his powerful body a shield against the worst of the elements. Ilara followed in his footsteps, her arms wrapped around Lily, her every muscle screaming in protest. But she didn't complain. She thought of Thorn's cruel smile, of Lily's innocent face, and she found a strength she never knew she possessed. They walked for hours, the forest a labyrinth of black trunks and shifting snow. Twice, Silas stopped, holding up a hand for silence, listening to the night. They could hear, far below them, the faint sound of men shouting, the baying of hounds. Thorn had not waited. He had come back. The sound spurred them on, fear a cold fire in their veins. Just before dawn, when Ilara felt she could not take another step, Silas stopped. "We're here," he breathed. Through the trees, she could just make out a small, dark shape, a tiny cabin almost completely camouflaged by a rock outcropping and heavy pines. It was barely more than a shed, but it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Silas pushed the door open, and they stumbled inside, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and relief. The cabin was cold and smelled of pine needles and damp earth, but it was safe. It was hidden. As Silas barred the door and worked to start a fire, Ilara looked down at Lily, who had slept through. The entire ordeal, protected and warm against her mother's heart. They had made it. For now, they were safe. The hunter's cabin was a world away from the relative comfort of Silas's home. It was a single cramped room with a stone hearth, a rough-hewn bunk, and a single small window that was little more than a slit in the logs. But it was a fortress. Tucked away in a forgotten valley, it was a place the civilized world had overlooked, a place where a man could truly disappear. For a week, they lived in that small, isolated world. The sounds of Thorn's search faded, replaced by the whispering of the pines and the cry of a lone hawk circling overhead. The fear that had been their constant companion began to recede, and in its place, something new and fragile began to grow. The enforced intimacy of the tiny cabin stripped away the last of their defenses. They were no longer the gruff hermit and the frightened runaway. They were simply Silas and Ilara, two people bound by a shared child and a shared hope for the future. He taught her the ways of the forest. He showed her which roots were edible, how to read the tracks of animals in the snow, how to tell the time by the sun. She, in turn, brought a softness to his rough-hewn world. She sang to Lily, her voice filling the small cabin with a melody that soothed the ragged edges of his soul. She organized their meager supplies with a quiet efficiency, turning the rough shelter into a semblance of a home. One evening, as a stew made from a rabbit Silas had snared simmered over the fire, he was carving a piece of wood. He was so absorbed in his work, he didn't notice Ilara watching him until she spoke. "What are you making?" she asked. He looked up. a faint flush on his cheeks. He held it out to her. It was a wolf, perfectly rendered, its head tilted as if listening to the wind. It was a small, beautiful thing, created by hands that were more accustomed to an axe than a carving knife. "It's for Lily," he said gruffly. "For when she's older." Alara took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered. Her eyes met his over the flickering firelight, and the unspoken words that had been building between them finally broke free. "Silas," she began, her voice barely audible. "Thank you. For everything." "There's nothing to thank me for," he said, looking away. "You gave me back my home," she insisted softly. "Not the cabin, but this." She gestured to the three of them, a small circle of warmth in the vast cold wilderness. "You gave me a family." His throat tightened. He had lost a family, and he never thought he would have one again. But this woman, this child. They had walked into his life and reignited a flame he thought had long since turned to ash. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. Her fingers were small and warm in his. "You saved me too, Alara," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a ghost. You made me real again." The admission hung in the air, a raw and powerful truth. They were not just survivors anymore. They were something more. The wolf lay on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel, a symbol of the wild, protective love that had taken root in the heart of the mountain. They were a pack of three, and they would face whatever came next together. But the world was not done with them yet. As the snows began to melt, Silas knew they couldn't stay in the hunting cabin forever. They needed a more permanent solution, a way to truly be free of Thorn's shadow. "I have to go back," he announced one morning. "Back to Stone Creek." Alara's heart seized with fear. "No, Silas, it's too dangerous. He'll be waiting." "He'll be waiting for us to make a mistake," Silas corrected. "For us to run blindly. I'm not going to run. I'm going to finish this." He explained his plan. He had some money saved, hidden in his old cabin from years of selling furs. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Enough to buy information, enough to buy an ally, enough to turn the tables on Thorn. "The sheriff," Silas said. "Henderson." He didn't want to be Thorn's man. He was pushed. I'm betting he'd rather be on the side of justice, if he thought it could win. Reluctantly, Alara agreed. She had come to trust his judgment, his quiet, formidable strength. He left at dawn, leaving her with the rifle and enough food for a week. The 2 days he was gone were the longest of her life. She kept the fire low and the door barred, starting at every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind. She held Lily close, whispering stories to her, stories of a brave woodsman who fought monsters. On the 3rd day, he returned. He was not alone. Behind him, riding cautiously, was Sheriff Henderson. Alara's hand flew to the rifle, but Silas held up a hand, a signal to wait. "It's all right," Silas said as he entered the cabin. "The sheriff is here to help." Henderson removed his hat, his face grim. He looked at Alara, at the baby in her arms, and a look of profound regret crossed his features. "Ma'am," he said, "I was wrong. I let that man's money and power blind me, but no more." He explained what had happened. Silas had met him secretly on the outskirts of town. He had given him the money not as a bribe, but as a retainer. "For what?" Alara asked. "To do my job," Henderson said. "To conduct a real investigation." Henderson had sent a wire to the city where Thorn came from, making inquiries. The answers had come back that morning. Marcus Thorn was indeed a wealthy man. But his first wife had not died of a fever, as he claimed. She had disappeared, under mysterious circumstances, right after signing her entire fortune over to him. There was no proof of foul play, but there was a cloud of dark suspicion that had followed him ever since. "He's not just a bully," Henderson said, his voice hard. "He's a predator, and his kind doesn't stop. With this information, and your testimony," he nodded to Ilara, "we can get a circuit judge to issue a warrant. Not for you, for him." A plan was formed, a risky, dangerous plan. Ilara would return to town, under the sheriff's protection. She would file a formal complaint against Thorne, backed by her aunt's letter and the new information from the sheriff. It would force a confrontation, a final, public showdown. "He won't let it get to a judge," Silas said. "He'll try to silence you before you can testify." "I know," Ilara said, her voice steady. "And you'll be waiting for him," Henderson finished, looking at Silas. "Not as a lawman, but as a concerned citizen, protecting his family." It was a trap, and they were the bait. They returned to Silas's old cabin, the place where it all began. The sheriff declared it under his official protection, a flimsy but necessary legal shield. The town of Stone Creek buzzed with rumours. Ilara's presence, under the sheriff's care, was a public challenge to Thorne's authority. Thorne, predictably, was incandescent with rage. He saw his power slipping away, his carefully constructed world threatened by a hysterical woman and a mountain hermit. He would not allow it. The final confrontation came on a cold, clear afternoon. Thorne didn't come with the law. He came with 3 hired guns, rough men with cold eyes who were loyal only to coin. They rode up to the cabin, their intentions clear. Sheriff Henderson stepped onto the porch. "That's far enough, Thorne," he warned. "You are violating a legal protection." "Your protection is meaningless," Thorne spat. "I'm taking my wife. Now." He and his men dismounted, drawing their weapons. Henderson drew his own, but he was outnumbered. It was a standoff, but Thorne had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed his enemy was on the porch. He hadn't counted on the man who knew the mountain as an extension of himself. From the tree line, a shot rang out. Not from Silas's rifle. It was a warning shot, fired from an old pistol that kicked up dirt at the feet of one of the hired guns. The man yelped, startled. Then another shot, from a different direction, splintered the porch rail near the second man. The hired guns, spooked and confused, looked to the forest, not to the cabin. They were being hunted. "It's Blackwood," one of them shouted. "He's in the trees." Silas was not in the trees. He was behind the woodpile, a silent shadow. He had spent the last hour creating diversions, using his knowledge of acoustics and ricochets to make 2 men sound like a dozen. As Thorne's men fired wildly into the woods, Silas moved. He was a force of nature, swift and silent. He disarmed the first man with a blow from a heavy log. The second he took down with a well-aimed rock to the head. The third, seeing his companions fall, lost his nerve and fled. Thorne was left alone, facing the sheriff. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He raised his own pistol to fire at Henderson, but a shape emerged from the shadows behind him. It was Silas. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He didn't need one. He grabbed Thorne, his hand a vice of iron on the man's shoulder, and spun him around. "It's over, Thorne," Silas said, his voice a low, deadly calm. Thorne, his bravado shattered, tried to struggle, but he was like a child in the woodsman's grip. He was a man whose power came from money and fear, and in the face of true primal strength, he had nothing. Henderson stepped forward and put the cuffs on him. "Marcus Thorne," the sheriff said with grim satisfaction, "you're under arrest." As they led him away, a broken, pathetic figure, Ilara, stepped out onto the porch, holding Lily. Her eyes met Silas's, and in that single silent look, a lifetime of gratitude, of respect, of love was exchanged. The storm was finally over. The shadow that had loomed over them for so long was gone. Spring had come to the mountain. In the months that followed, the mountain and the town at its feet began to heal. The story of Silas and Ilara, of the hermit who faced down a tyrant, became a local legend. The people of Stone Creek, who had once shunned Silas, now greeted him with a quiet respect. They had seen his courage, and they had seen the truth of his character. They brought gifts to the cabin, a sack of potatoes, a freshly baked pie, a hand-knitted blanket for Lily. It was their way of apologizing, of welcoming him back into the fold of the community. Silas, for the first time in years, did not turn them away. With Thorne's power broken, his assets frozen by the courts, a new sense of peace settled over the valley. Ilara was officially granted a divorce, her freedom legally and lastingly secured. She was no longer a runaway, no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She and Silas, with Lily between them, began to build a life. It was a quiet life, built not on grand declarations, but on small, everyday moments of grace. It was in the way he built a proper sturdy cradle for Lily, his large hands sanding the wood until it was as smooth as silk. It was in the way she planted a small garden of herbs by the cabin door, her laughter filling the air as Lily tried to help by eating the dirt. It was in the comfortable silences they shared in the evenings, watching the fire, a shared language of peace and contentment passing between them. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, Silas turned to Ilara. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a simple, unadorned ring, hammered from a piece of silver he had traded for in town. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I'm not the kind of man you ever imagined. But Ilara, will you and Lily, will you be my family?" Tears streamed down Ilara's face, but they were tears of joy. She didn't need a fancy ring or a grand proposal. She had the heart of a good, strong man, a man who had walked through the fires of hell and come out the other side, a man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Yes," she whispered, her hand closing over his. "We already are." He slipped the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. Lily, now a toddler with her mother's dark eyes and her protector's stubborn spirit, clapped her hands in delight, as if she understood the profound significance of the moment. The ghosts that had haunted the cabin were finally gone, replaced by the vibrant, hopeful presence of a new family, a family born not of blood, but of a blizzard, of courage, and of a love as strong and enduring as the mountain itself. The man who was once a hermit had become a husband and a father. The woman who was once a fugitive had found her home. And the baby who had been left to die in the snow had become the heart of it all. Years later, the cabin on the mountain was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a beacon of warmth and life. 2 more children, a boy with Silas's quiet strength and a girl with Ilara's fiery spirit, filled its rooms with laughter. The garden Ilara had planted had expanded, its bounty shared freely with the folks in Stone Creek. Silas Blackwood was still a man of few words, but the winter in his eyes had thawed completely, replaced by the gentle, steady warmth of a man at peace. His hands, once tools of survival, were now most often used to hold his wife's hand, to lift his children into the air, or to carve intricate wooden animals that were treasured by every child in the valley. The story of their beginning became a legend, a tale told by the hearth on cold winter nights. It was a story about how the harshest winter can give way to the most beautiful spring, how a family can be found in the most unexpected of places, and how the cry of a single helpless child can be powerful enough to save not 1 life, but 3. Sometimes, travelers passing through Stone Creek would ask about the quiet, powerful man who lived on the mountain, and the townspeople would smile. They would say he was a man who had learned that the greatest strength is not in building walls to keep the world out, but in having the courage to open your door, even in the middle of a storm. And as the sun would set behind the jagged peaks, casting a golden glow over the valley, one could almost imagine the mountain itself holding its breath, not in fear, but in a state of quiet, profound grace, guarding the family that had taught it, and everyone who knew their story, the true meaning of home. And now we ask you, what does it truly mean to be a family? Is it a bond of blood, or is it a choice made in the heart? Think of a time a stranger showed you unexpected kindness, a moment that changed the course of your day, or even your life. What would you do if you found a life, abandoned and in need, on your own doorstep? Share your thoughts and your own stories of found families and unexpected heroes in the comments below. Your story matters here. And if this tale of courage and love touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the deepest wilderness, the most powerful force of all is the human heart. Thank you for watching.